There's a water machine in the kitchen if you guys need any your cups and stuff. Hey, Joel. You can put your stuff behind us if you want.
What brings you here today? I'm part of the carpet removal. Hello, welcome. Hi. What's in my own bathroom? Are you the my little sick cat? Oh yeah. Yeah.
What do you guys think? I've got two video sources for my webcam onto me, which is not as good quality as this other one, which is focused out on here. And the reason I ask is because Steve and a couple others have much more knowledge than I do about a few specific subjects that we're going to go over. So we'll be kind of talking amongst the group. I don't know if that's working right now.
I thought it was the water machine.
Oh, the water. It's a big black thing in the corner in the kitchen.
Like that copy of my popcorn. It might be better in case anybody doesn't want to be filmed, to have all the people who are talking in one location, like on the couch or.
Yeah, that's a good point. Do you mind sitting on the couch, Steve?
Well, what if I just shut this so you don't hear my obscenity? I'll leave it for now. Okay. Wi-Fi information?
There is. It's Mentor CG Guest, and the password is Troll Talk, all lowercase. I didn't think that was going to happen, if I'm perfectly honest. So Pasha messaged me and said he's going to be a couple minutes late, but wanted us to wait till he gets here to.
Yeah, people probably feel good.
Yeah.
The next few minutes.
I didn't know that we were actually streaming, but apparently we are.
Already?
Somebody watching me eat oatmeal. Oh no.
Yeah.
Oh, you already have it.
Yeah.
Streaming both of them?
Yeah, so actually what you see right now, this is what's going out on the screen. So when this goes, when I put the keynote at full screen, it's going to take over the TV, so you'll see. But the live broadcast will have the cameras going like this. And so when the wolf gets here, I'll ask him to sit there too. I must have accidentally clicked the start button, but whatever. We're going on. So. By the way, if anyone needs to use the bathroom, it's just on the other side of that wall right there. Just go that way.
Uh-huh.
Oh wow, look. I'm live streaming myself. Who's that handsome looking dude? Yeah, I did. I'm like addicted to this campaign in a bad way. So I usually am pretty involved.
I don't want it to end.
Yeah, it's like, you know, I don't want it to end until it's more like 90-10 or something. I have international friends I'm just not comfortable with, you know, where the ratio is right now is like 55-45.
That was the expectation with Brexit, right? They expected it to go not be
Yeah.
The polls were always pretty mixed on Brexit. It's really not analogous to this election.
I
It was the prediction markets that reflected Brexit, not
I met a guy who works at a startup called Curiously. It's spelled Qriosly, and they do mobile surveying using mobile ads. And they published a white paper after Brexit saying that they were the only major polling organization to get everything perfectly correct with Brexit by doing real-time mobile polling. And so they've been employing this for, actually, interestingly, their clients are mainly like investment banks and hedge funds and that sort of thing, who are trying to gather like sentiment from crowds in order to make financial bets on what things might be. For example, like making a bet before like an earnings report announcement, that sort of thing. But I would wonder how they're polling different things in this election.
Yeah, if they get it right, they may end up being the hottest thing for the 2020 election.
All right, I'm gonna close this door.
Okay, I'm supposed to go now.
Okay. Okay, cool. So, glad to see you guys came to check this out. All right, come on in. We're just getting started. So I'll start by introducing myself, and then I'll ask the three others from Carbon Removal. Actually, can we save that spot for one guy who's coming? Because that's actually live on camera. We're live streaming this right now. My name is Paul Gamble, and I'm the organizer for Carbon Removal Seattle. We're a meetup group that's been meeting for about, I'm sorry, we don't need that ladder anymore, so if you want to put that down. Okay. Just hold the camera right there. So I started this in September of last year with the stated mission of trying to kind of plant a flag and attract people who are interested in carbon removal from an entrepreneurial perspective. So what this presentation is going to be about is giving you a broad overview of the climate situation, which we're probably mostly familiar with, what carbon removal is, and what are the different methods that are currently being researched and employed to do so. And then we'll talk about a little bit about who's working on this right now and kind of how this goes out into the future. I mentioned earlier there are a few topics in here where some of the other members in the group have much more knowledge about than I do, so we'll kind of do a brief overview and then maybe do a deep dive. This can totally be an interactive discussion, so if you want, stop me, ask questions, and we'll talk it through. We've got plenty of time to go over this stuff. I also have a few videos to kind of go through some stuff in here as well. Any questions or anything before I get started? Cool. Okay, so why carbon removal? Why do we need to do this? Why is this important? This is a diagram from, what was it called, David? The oil
The
something
sky's
report?
limit. The limit of the sky.
The limit of the skies?
The report.
Okay. So this came out very recently, and what this shows is that if we look back to what happened in the Paris talks, the UN climate Paris talks last December, they set a goal of let's not even get to 2 degrees of warming, let's try to keep it to 1.5 degrees warming. And what this shows us is how we would actually be able to do that. And what we're looking at is present day is right around here or so. And basically, we have 4 or 5 years to start ramping down and then ramping down very quickly before we get to zero emissions in around 2050 or so, if we have any chance of actually staying below these targets. This is really, really unlikely to happen for a whole bunch of organizational and political and bureaucratic reasons. But this is showing how dire this thing is. Climate change and this rise in temperature is much more real and much more serious than people are talking about or treating, and it deserves a lot more attention. Here's another diagram from the same report where if we look at this top part of this graph, it's over the history. On the y-axis are the amount of gigatons of carbon dioxide that are emitted globally each year. So right now we're at about 40 gigatons, and a gigaton is 1 billion tons happening every year. For scale, by the way, you as an individual, on an individual scale, are responsible for 30 to 50 tons per year. And so 40 gigatons is what's happening. If we were to stay constant, that's the top. This is showing what mitigation would be like without carbon removal. And we're trying to say that we have like a quota. There's only so much more carbon dioxide that we can emit, and there are other greenhouse gases, but so much that we can emit in order to stay below these temperature targets. If we don't do anything, we're going to run out of carbon budget, in the next 5 to 10 years. And if we do carbon removal, then this is showing how we try to get to that point where we're still around 2040 or so, trying to get to negative emissions just happening normally on an annual basis, and then continuing to remove emissions over time. We usually hear talk about this climate change issue in terms of temperature, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees Celsius. I personally think that a much better metric is to think about how much carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere in terms of parts per million. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, which we can see, well, this is a logarithmic scale, so or not, but it's thousands of years. So around this blip right here is right before the Industrial Revolution took off. It was around 280 parts per million, and that was sort of stable over time. Since then, we have skyrocketed, and we are now well over 400 parts per million, and that's not going back down anymore. You might have seen in the last year, when was that? Like earlier this year, where there are seasonal fluctuations that we can measure. That sometimes we would go down a few, up a few, and so recently we went over 400, and we're not going back anytime soon. The IPCC estimates that around 450 is when stuff starts to get really dangerous and scary. And if you project out our current rate of emissions over time, by the end of the century, we could be around 600 parts per million. It's going up about 3 to 4 every year. And that's accelerating because as more countries, more developing countries are developing and industrializing, they're emitting more. And not just because they're burning lots and lots of coal, but they're using more energy to fund the activities that they can afford as they get wealthier. So this is kind of the fundamental political problem of you have these Western industrialized countries who are much wealthier, who have basically put us in this position. That's including the United States. And then you have the more developing countries who are who want to expand and grow their economies, and they have to expend a lot of energy to do so. And so now we're sort of stuck in this position where we're trying to tell the whole world we all need to stop emitting, but we're also telling a whole group of countries that no, you don't get the right to do the same thing that we did, and you don't get to benefit your citizens in that way. Anyway, we're over 400 parts per million, and that's going up. When it gets warmer, what that means is that we will start seeing more ice melt. The really scary stuff is when permafrost in Canada and Siberia starts to melt faster. That releases organic matter that's trapped underneath it, that hits the air, starts decomposing, that releases methane into the atmosphere. Methane is 25 times worse than carbon dioxide in terms of warming effect. So if we start getting closer and closer to this negative runaway feedback loop that we can't really stop. So think about parts per million. We're gonna focus on that number throughout the rest of this presentation. And it is worse than you think, because if, let's say that among any of these carbon removal technologies we're going to talk about, let's say we're super successful and we're able to remove tons of carbon, a lot of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. There's so much extra carbon dioxide as part of the carbon cycle stored in oceans right now that they're oversaturated, that as we pull it out of the air, the oceans are going to off-gas more carbon dioxide just as air pressure would equalize over time. So it's more than just removing carbon dioxide right now from the atmosphere. It's going to be a long, ongoing thing. And that last line there about 50 parts per million, I didn't mention that we're over 400 right now, but the goal, the target, should be to get back down to around 350 parts per million of CO2. That's estimated to be relatively safe. We get some of the advantages that warming has, because there are advantages. In fact, the first guy who discovered the greenhouse effect, I think, was a Finnish scientist in the 19th century who said, this is great, things are going to warm up, we're going to be able to grow more crops, we'll have a longer growing season, we won't have as much energy costs trying to heat things and stuff. So there are advantages to gain from it, and 350 is kind of this safe target. It's also just a nice round number. But we're going to have to remove more than just 50. So how much of that is it? Well, I mentioned earlier that we're at about 40 gigatons happening annually. 700 is sort of a rough approximation of how many gigatons we have to remove right now. That, of course, goes up by 40 and then increasing every year. That's a whole lot of carbon dioxide. Before going on, any questions or any? It's all pretty standard. Okay, so how do we get there? I'm going to go over a bunch of different carbon negative technologies, and then at the very end we have a couple that are carbon neutral but are going to be very important in this whole process. And one thing I want to say before we get into these is that these all have their own advantages and disadvantages. They are all going to be necessary and crucial to carbon removal as a strategy. There is no, it's not like we're trying to choose one of these and focus on them. They're all important. So we'll start with the question I hear the most often, which is, well, can't we just plant more trees? And the answer is no, we can't. We would need to plant trees on all arable land on Earth in order to do this, and even then, maybe not. And then we wouldn't be able to grow any food. So what's the point? So reforestation, while it does need to happen, isn't really going to be the solution to the problem. This next one, though, is the most common that you'll hear discussed at a sort of like geopolitical level. It's called bioenergy carbon capture and sequestration, or BECS for short. Carbon capture sequestration is something that we've already been doing for quite a while. If you hear about this, it's power plants, whether they're coal or natural gas fired, will have filters basically placed on top of the smokestacks that react with the emissions from the burning of the fuel, and they can capture a percentage of whatever emissions are going up. That has energy costs unto itself. So if you're running a plant at like 3 megawatts and you are trying to capture some of it, you're not going to get 3 megawatts of output from that plant. So there's a cost to this, which makes it difficult and expensive. This is why when people talk about clean coal, they're lying. There's no such thing as that. There are very few cases where it's cost effective to remove 100%. In fact, we just found out about one, was in India last week, that said that they have a business model in place that will work, that's profitable, where they can capture 100%. But this is like the first time you've heard of anything like this before. So the way that this would work is it's adding another layer to it. So we've got the CCS happening at the power plant level, but with bioenergy, we're talking about taking a biomass feedstock. So we're growing crops. As these crops grow, they suck down carbon dioxide as part of photosynthesis, and then as we harvest them, and then we transport them to the plant, and we burn those for the energy, and that will release emissions from it, but we capture those emissions. What we do after that with the captured emissions is an open question. There are all sorts of industries that would purchase carbon dioxide and other chemicals like that for use. Carbon dioxide usage can be used for agriculture and greenhouses, can be used for carbonated beverages. Unfortunately, the most common use for it is for enhanced oil recovery and fracking, which is just pulling out more oil, which sort of defeats the purpose. This is an open question, and this is like part of the business model problem of what do you do with the CO2 after it's captured. A lot of people talk about, well, we could bury it, and we could use existing oil wells that we've pulled oil out, we could put it back in, or other methods like that, but there remains a problem of cost. Who's going to pay for that, and why would they? Any questions about this one? If you ever, carbon removal is starting to get more coverage in the press, and more high-level officials are starting to talk about it. And when they're talking about it, they're almost always referring to BECCS. Any studies that I have seen that look at like how effective could carbon removal be over time are pretty much solely looking at BECCS. This is happening on like an industrial, commercial scale, and that's really the only way people are thinking about it right now. Next up is, this is my personal favorite. This is called direct air capture. And so this is the idea of we're just going to pull it out of the air, just straight out of the air. What we're looking at is a diagram from a company in British Columbia called Carbon Engineering. Bill Gates is invested in this company, but there are several others that are doing a very similar sort of thing. And basically, they have a bank of huge fans that are pulling in air from the atmosphere and are running it through an electrochemical process where it requires energy input, and they're able to pull out carbon dioxide from it. So this solution, and I don't remember what they're using for that, goes into the, whoops, I don't know why that happened, goes into well, the air is coming in and it's being mixed into this capture solution. So now it's got carbon dioxide inside it, and then they're using electrolysis to pull that out. This is another industrial scale sort of approach where they come out with liquid carbon dioxide and then they can sell that as a commodity product.
I like this one as well because if we're refining oil by tankloads at a time, and that's getting released into the atmosphere, this is an industrial way of trying to take more carbon dioxide out So what do they do with the CO2 now?
They're capturing like a negligible amount, so I don't think they're really doing anything with it. It's on the order of like, I think it was on tons, like in the single digits per day. They're also currently mostly using natural gas for the energy, but they want to be switching over to a more renewable source. Like I said, there are like at least 5 companies that are doing stuff like this, and they all work under a similar sort of process. I'll talk a little bit more about that later.
What are the energy inputs like for?
Like how much energy?
Yeah.
I don't remember. I don't remember. They're I think it's enough that they're not able to rely on like their own renewable energy source where they are. But I don't know. How
Is there a
much
ratio of energy input to carbon removal?
Right now, it's pretty low. So right now, this is not ready to scale up, and it certainly would not be profitable. But everyone's in the sort of like prototyping and trying to figure this out, how to scale this approach right now. Back to very energy intensive way. Now, this is, I'm going to show you a video in a second. We'll watch only the first couple of minutes of it. I'll share out the links for these full videos later. What we're going to look at is a month ago, I went to Arizona State University, where the Center for Negative Carbon Emissions is located. And there was a conference called Closing the Carbon Cycle, and this was mostly about fuels, and we'll talk about fuels in a little bit. But there's been some interesting research going on there. There's a pretty renowned physicist named Klaus Lackner who has been sort of leading the way when it comes to research on this for a couple of decades at this point. And he's at ASU now, and what we're going to be looking at is what's called the moisture swing. And they've developed a passive material that passively absorbs carbon dioxide. And so the video will explain how this works in a second. So this is a very different method than what we just looked at.
I think basically famous for the material properties of certain materials that absorb CO2 and it's wet, basically. Laminar and exchange membrane and change materials on the like that famous work like under the other cell. Well, and we use it.
I'm streaming this over AirPlay.
We have these, this is an example.
Just hold it down on the ground. Or down. It's fine. All right, bear with me.
So in the meantime, one of the things that I'm interested in is trying to find a way that after this industrial process of collecting carbon dioxide, whatever way is most efficient, is to find a way to find a market for that, afterwards that it can be used maybe as a fuel. That would be ideal because then we could start using it as a I guess any other kind of market that besides using it for colas and things like that. There's just either that or finding a way to split the carbon and the oxygen off so that we can keep the oxygen. That's one of the reasons why I don't like the idea of burying it in the ocean or underground or wherever. Is that if we do that with all the carbon dioxide that we've done with the trillions of gallons of fuel that we've used, we're not going to have any oxygen left. I mean, we need the oxygen, and so that's my two favorite ideas: is either use it as a fuel, or to find a way to split the carbon and the oxygen apart and salvage the oxygen and keep it.
Maybe I'm understanding this poorly, but if you use the carbon that was sequestered, the CO2 that was sequestered, wouldn't you just be putting it back into the atmosphere?
Yeah, it depends on how you use it, but yeah.
Well, it's possible, yes, that you could be, but then it creates a loop where instead, if you're using it as a fuel, if that's what you're talking about, where let's use it in terms of a gallon. Let's say that we get a gallon of carbon dioxide liquid, right? Just bear with me. And then we use that as a fuel. What that means is that we prevented another gallon of gasoline coming out of and consuming more oxygen and creating more carbon dioxide. So basically, it's kind of like a recycling. The same thing we do with paper and aluminum cans. It would be a way of recycling. So, good question.
While this is going, any other questions so far?
Yeah, so you said around 400 parts per million is pretty damaging, but could you be a little bit more specific, like even in terms of climatic effects or?
Like what sort of effects we're already starting to see?
Sure, you said that specifically at 400 parts per million.
Oh, no, for around 450.
Oh, sorry.
Well, it's not like we hit a number and then all of a sudden stuff starts happening.
Yeah.
It's on a scale. It's just that as we get closer and closer to that, that's a very dangerous point. And one of the big things is ice melt. And it's not just sea level rise, but it's exposing this organic matter that's been trapped under ice for so long to the air, and then that starts releasing methane, which is significantly worse than carbon dioxide.
So right now it seems like 450 is where you hit the feedback loop.
Well, it sort of. David, can you help me?
I'm not aware of anybody putting a precise number on the threshold. Since the Industrial Revolution, when we've gone from 180 to now we're at 400, we've already crossed the point where glaciers are melting. Pretty much all the glaciers on the planet are going to be history at some point. And probably the ice cap on the North Pole and Antarctica is starting to show signs of melting also. So we've already crossed some thresholds that are self-reinforcing. But where the threshold is, where the methane starts coming out in a way that we can't stop, isn't entirely clear. There probably are people studying that or coming up with theories about that, but I haven't seen that number publicized.
Yeah, and permafrost is already starting to melt. All the rigs and trucks that are being stuck in the mud.
Yeah.
That's been happening for well over 10 years now. So where they used to be able to drive trucks across the ice with permafrost, because it's thawing now, they're getting stuck in the mud.
There are a lot of different signs all around the world, like the Great Barrier Reef. Did you see that in the news, like in the last couple weeks or so, about basically people pronouncing it dead? That's not really going to come back. Not so much the quantity of crazy storms that happen, but the amplitude of major storms is increasing over time. Sea level rise is, of course, very measurable and is already happening. I think the mayor of Miami has been trying for a while now to try to get federal input on this because they're starting to see it. So there are definitely significant signs all around the world. All right, I think this is working out.
And what Klaus was, I think, basically famous for is discovering, anyway, some material, some properties of certain materials that absorb CO2 when they are dry and release it when it's wet, basically. And it's a quaternary ionic exchange membrane, and we can show you something what the little things look like under the microscope. And what we have done, and they use this in water treatment, and so we have these. This is an example of this membrane, if you will. Actually, these are resin particles that are embedded in this membrane. So that membrane is really about 50% active particles that will capture the CO2 and release it. So, from an engineering standpoint, all I worry about is you dry it and it grabs CO2 and you wet it and it releases it. And I'm sort of charged with getting that CO2 out in some larger volume, on the order of a kilogram a day or something. We do have some other materials that Alan has found from Belarus that is 100% resin, and he's testing that in this device right now to see how well it captures CO2 and releases it. This material has been chopped up, made into different forms, a rug, a fern tree, things that might increase the surface area or not. This is like our greenhouse mock-up, if you will. This is a single plant, and then this is a carpet of this material that's been sitting out. It's been a little humid these last few days, so because this works on a moisture swing, it will capture the maximum CO2 when it's dry, and if it's very humid, if it's raining, you won't capture anything. So we have on this screen and on that screen CO2 and water content being measured in the air here. So I'm going to quickly insert this, and what should happen is this rug will essentially absorb water vapor. So it's an exchange that goes on at the ion exchange membrane, and it absorbs water vapor and will give off the CO2. When it dries, it's just the reverse. The water vapor leaves the membrane. So hopefully we will see this kind of go up if this has been dry enough. If not, we can always cheat and squirt it with water. I'm sorry, the CO2, the red one should go up, and the blue one will probably suck it down. And we can also see the numbers on the top here. So if I'm watching that, we'll see that go up. It looks like it might be coming up. So no cheating. Right on blowing it. Of course, the designs we're actually working on, Klaus has gone through a number of iterations, and what we're kind of settling on right now, and this is you heard Peter and Dr. Rittman talk about his algae, so we're the ones supplying them with the CO2, and we're going to do it using this membrane. This is our cube. It's got the membrane in sheets, and the idea is that, and these sheets are spaced at a distance such that at about 1 meter per second wind speed, it will collect CO2. So if we were perhaps in a higher wind speed regime, we could pack more sheets in here. But this is kind of the design we're working on. Then we're going to put these into a panel. Let's see if we can open that up for people. And the idea will be that we'll soak that. And you can see that here that this is in fact doing
This is around the part where it just kind of goes on like that. Let me show you the next video, which was a demonstration of their prototype product. So they've got this resin material, right? And this is in Phoenix, and it turns out that it's very important that you're in a dry, arid environment. And they expose this material to the air for a certain period of time. They're still optimizing how long that is. And then after a while, it's saturated with CO2, and then they fold it back down and they put it into a water bath. And as they let it sit in water, that carbon dioxide off gases from the resin material, and then they can drain the water and it gets exposed to water. Then they drain the water, and then it starts off-gassing the carbon dioxide. So they're doing this under pressure, and then it should spit out carbon dioxide in gaseous form. I might have to do this process all over again. The next video is showing their full-scale prototype of.
For a couple $100 we could solve that.
It remains really loud, so I'm just going to leave it turned down. So they're planning on putting a bunch of these on top of one of the buildings at ASU and working this out. I think their goal is to have this ready to go by March. I think that's what their grant stipulates. And when it's so this is imagine that it was in a tank at the bottom, and then everything is being pulled up and exposed to the air while it dries off, and then it will be dry and capturing CO2, and then they'll put it back down into this water bath. They estimated, and I don't know if these numbers are actually correct, because this was the mechanical engineer who was building this thing and telling me. They estimated that they could pull about 20 kilograms of CO2 a day from one of these machines with the capacity that the resin material that they're using has right now. So this is like very, very early prototype. So this is it up, and then it would just go back down.
So what is it captures carbon dioxide out of the air.
Yep.
And then at the end of the process, what happens to the carbon dioxide?
It's pressurized into a tank. And they've been using it for, because we're going to talk about fuels in a minute, because that's what their focus is at the Center for Negative Carbon Emissions. So they've been using this CO2 as feedstock for algae, so you can make biodiesel out of that. But you could also use it for feedstock for converting into fuels, and I have a slide for that. Second. There's one more direct air capture thing I want to show. So that sort of idea of passively absorbing CO2 without energy input is what I find the most interesting out of all this. And so this is an abstract from a study done at Rice that was published just a couple months ago. But this follows on some work they did a couple of years ago, where they took buckyballs, which are carbon-60 atoms. They have a molecular structure that looks sort of like a soccer ball. That's what that is right there, and this is the actual material. And when that's reacted with PEHA, they are able to, at basically room temperature, able to passively absorb, I think it was 60%, 65% of its mass in carbon dioxide. So it's this sort of like sandy material, and it just absorbs that over time. I don't remember over how long that took. I don't think it said.
Does it ever release it when the temperature drops?
So far, I don't know if they've studied how to release it from this stuff, which is an interesting sort of question, because that's usually what people ask about it. But I sometimes wonder, well, do we care? Can we create a right that is somehow like financially feasible in a business model? So this is the stuff I find the most interesting. All right, so we'll move on to another method This is called soil restoration. This is a very, very critical one. This, along with Beck's, are probably the two most popular. So soil restoration is the idea that modern agricultural practices have just completely decimated our soils everywhere. By tilling all the time and by using monoculture, single crops in an area, we've exposed a lot of carbon that was trapped in the soil and being used by the various microbes and other little animals that live inside of there and the various plants and stuff. So trying to change our agricultural practices and getting this carbon back into the soil can store a significant amount of it. Steve, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, there's the company. Essentially, the Monsanto and the chemical fertilizer people, they have this big, there are whole companies around trying to get farmers and producers to use their stuff. And by going back to a natural way and the carbon's back in the soil, the microorganisms still in the soil, they won't need that much fertilizer. They won't need all these chemicals. And if they don't till, and essentially what a lot of the farmers are being told to do by the government is to plant a crop for 3 months, and then they harvest it, and then they till their land, and they leave their land all open. They don't have any vegetation on it at all, and that was the practices before. And they do this because they're preparing for the next harvest or next planting season, and so they will get ahead of that by leaving the soil open like that. Any kind of wind or any kind of it's going to destroy the soil. It's like all the carbon out of the soil just floats away. Any kind of weather and stuff. So the new practice is leave a plant there or plant another plant called a cover crop. And so it's like barley or something that you probably don't necessarily need, but it could be. And then also bring
Should be easy to grow too.
yeah, easy to grow. It's easy. The seeds aren't expensive or anything like that.
And then you till the cover crop into the ground, right? So to keep the carbon.
They don't need to till anymore. They essentially mush it down into the
Okay.
ground. They bring rollers over it and just slowly push it down. And then when they come through and poke seeds in the ground for the next crop, the seeds in the next crop, they smash it essentially.
Okay.
And the crop will grow above the smashed vegetation, and the smashed vegetation becomes like fertilizer and material to do that.
So this is a video that's actually going to explain everything that and show you everything that Steve just said. This is called Soil Carbon Cowboys. It was a short film made a couple of years ago. The filmmaker was at the conference I was at, and so that's how I learned about this.
And the few bold ranchers who got the guts to change when nature forced their hand.
When my wife and I went through the 4 years of crop failure, I'm sure I was not a pleasant man to be around in that it was extremely high stress.
He was having the financial problems and couldn't make payments, and the bank figured we should sell the land and keep doing what we were doing with the big machinery with less land when we dug it a little faster.
But my wife and I'll tell you, the best thing that could have happened to us. Because what it was, it forced us to start looking at the soil.
Since the 1800s, letting cattle roam freely for weeks and months was second nature.
Well, this would be a very typical conventionally grazed situation, and where they're allowed to just keep returning back to the exact same area day after day to graze.
But then you start getting cows eating the same plant all the time, and then they go after the best ones, and that weakens the root system on those, so the poorer plants take over. So we ended up with poor pasture every year.
With their pastures dying, Neil's wife insisted he take a class from someone teaching a new way to graze.
I soon found out it was easier to go along and argue with her, so I went for the one day, but I didn't want to be there. So from 98 to 2004, I tried to prove him wrong, and I didn't have much luck. Everything started turning around when I started doing things different. I got different results.
Results produced by grazing that regenerates the soil, equal parts art and science, with a splash of history.
Our prairie soils were formed by large herds of bison, elk. They would move, they'd graze an area, and keep moving. And they might not return to that area for a year or maybe 2 years.
To mimic this herd migration, they break up their ranches into small areas called paddocks.
I'm going out to set up a temporary fence to make a small paddock of 1 acre or less. So I hang a bat latch on the permanent post, and 12 feet away, I found a temporary post to string my wire across, and then I come back and put my step-in pigtails in. And then I go put electricity in the fence, and that's it. I can put one up and down 1/4 mile in 18 minutes.
I'll put anywhere from 800 to 1,000 head on an acre or half an acre.
The cattle readily move into a new paddock because they always know they're going to get a fresh bite of grass. And what happens is that at higher stock densities, these cattle feel like things are a little competitive. They figure if I don't get it, my neighbor's going to get it. So they go ahead and grab and bite and grab and bite.
In 2 to 2.5 hours, it'll be either eaten or trapped on the ground.
We graze it and then we get the heck off of it.
It's ate off pretty good. You'll see some places that are a bit shorter than others.
The magic is how long to stay on.
This is an 80-day recovery on this one right now. That's where I think I need to be instead of anything less.
For several decades, we sort of pushed monocultures in pastures. Plant just Bermuda grass or just fescue. Why? Because it was easy. You were managing for one species. You knew how to fertilize a monoculture. But when you manage a polyculture, a cocktail mix, then that's something that for today's generation is a little foreign.
I'll take you down and show you that cocktail mix that I threw in so we get a picture of it before the cows eat it. This here is black medic. It's a legume. It puts down nitrogen.
This species right here is called hairy vetch. Very high in protein. It'll be over 30% protein.
I got sunflowers, corn.
This plant here is called Phacelia. That flower attracts the pollinators, and we want the pollinators in our system.
In many areas of the U.S. and in many areas globally, we're seeing a dearth of pollinator insects. And we have found that if we provide the habitat for pollinators, they will return.
These are sow thistles. They're a weed. But if you eat them when they're just flowering or in the bud, early bud stage, they're higher protein than what the alfalfa is.
My philosophy now is this. If livestock eat it, and it provides nutrition to those livestock, it's not a weed, it's a forage.
Some guys might get the spray can out. They want to spray every weed there is.
And the truth is, if I went in here and sprayed a herbicide to take care of these small amount of weeds that we have, I would also be taking care of my red clover, white clover, and all my other legumes in there and getting rid of those. And we're saving money. We're not having to buy a herbicide. We're not having to employ machinery, tractors and equipment to put it out as well.
Why do I want to go out and spend thousands upon thousands of dollars every year on synthetic fertilizer when I can grow these crops, for just the cost of the seed. They'll make the nitrogen for me, and then my livestock will come around and eat these plants, convert it to dollars for me to sell. So I'm getting all my fertilizer basically for a profit because I'm making money off of these crops.
You know, these plants are just almost going nuts, so to speak, with photosynthetic activity once we take the cattle off. And that is allowing these plants, as they're rapidly regrowing, to capture carbon out of the air, you know, and put it back into the soil.
Because of overgrazing, overuse of chemicals, and erosion, the amount of carbon in our soils is dangerously low.
I think our whole world revolves around the carbon in the soil because it's those carbon molecules that feed soil life. And it's those microorganisms that feed all the plants that nourish all the animals that feed civilization.
Many have thought restoring large amounts of carbon to soil would take centuries. These folks only need a decade, maybe less.
Last month we did soil tests on our operation, and what we found is that we've over tripled the amount of organic matter, in other words, the amount of carbon stored in our soil.
Carbon-rich soils soak up heavy rainfall. Carbon-depleted soils don't.
When there was quite a bit of rain, the water would run down the hill, and there would be water laying in the bottom of that slough. And now I get better water infiltration. That doesn't happen to me anymore.
In 1993, we could only infiltrate 1/2 inch of rainfall per hour. Now we can infiltrate over 8 inches of rainfall per hour. Think of the ramifications of that. I tell people, it's not how much moisture and rainfall you get, it's how much can your soils hold.
Because carbon-rich soils hold on to water, they help the ranchers weather droughts.
This was seeded 8 weeks ago, and it's only seen 38/100ths an inch of rainfall. Yet look how healthy it is.
So it's definitely beneficial to do this sort of thing, but trying to get corporate agriculture to change their practices is not really possible.
There's some things the government is crop insurance. To get crop insurance, you have to only plant one type of seed, and you have to use certain fertilizers for that to get the crop insurance. Because they don't believe your crop will be good unless you don't use those fertilizers and use that one seed. And those are GMO, genetic modified seeds that are more expensive now.
Another thing to add about that is that notice like how important the cattle were to that. So these are grass-fed cattle, which are healthier for people and healthier for the cattle too, because you're not forcing them to eat something they're not supposed to. Which is important as we consider the impact of livestock on climate change and the emissions that come from that. And so it's definitely possible to sort of change our systems so that we are able to continue eating meat and eat healthy meat while also solving the problem at the same time.
So quick question, and I'm sorry to interject, but how would you do this strategy if you didn't have, I mean, this seems to work very well for a situation where you have livestock.
Yeah.
But if it were just a regular crop of corn or cotton or whatever, how would you do this strategy?
You're mimicking by doing the no-till by smooshing the land, and you're mimicking the herds coming across it by smashing everything down and having the thing there. That's how you're mimicking the coverage. Yeah, there's always grasses and stuff, and by having them doing the different types of weeds and different types of mixture in their the root system, the different depths of roots for the different seeds and plants that are growing, that makes the soil come back better even. Like if you don't have sunflower seeds will grow deeper than just grass. Grass only grows like a couple inches or so. And the more kind of plants that will grow at different depths. The more deeper you go, the more stronger you'll get deeper into the soil, and then you'll be able to sequester more carbon. And usually the farmers that have pretty bad lands when they first start, it takes them 3 years to start turning everything around and start doing start sequestering the carbon in the soil. The soil health will start increasing in 3 years.
Okay, any more questions about the soil? All right, so the next one is mineralization, and this is also sometimes called weatherization, although there are a few different variants of this. What we're looking at is a picture of an operation in Iceland. Does anyone remember hearing about this about a year ago, where researchers took a slurry of like CO2-rich water. So they took CO2 captured from power plants in Iceland. And Iceland, by the way, gets like 85% of its energy from geothermal energy sources. So it's mostly renewable, but what fuel they do burn, they captured that and then they injected it deep into some basalt rock formations. And what they found, which was super, super surprising, was that in just a period of 2 years, 95% of that that they injected into the rocks had mineralized and turned into rock. So this is mineralization is sort of theorized as the main thing that stabilized the carbon cycle over Earth's evolution, at least up until humans started intervening. And there are other sorts of ways to go about this. We know of and have talked with some people who are doing research on enhanced weatherization. So they're trying to do this at a much more rapid pace under pressure. So imagine doing this sort of thing inside a pressure cooker. There's also a company out of the Netherlands that they mine a mineral called olivine, and when they basically expose that olivine to precipitation, it mineralizes into the soil as well. So what they're doing is they're literally just mining this stuff out of the ground, and then they're just throwing this rock out. So it's like a landscaping product, and I think they just signed a deal to provide rocks for building a large train track or replacing the material in a large train track in Europe.
You also use it on roofing material, so that you're building it that way too.
That's a slower process though, and it's hard to measure how much that actually stores, but that's another thing. So this Iceland one was very, very interesting because that happened so quickly. No one was expecting it to happen in 2 years. Water capture. So I mentioned that there's a lot of excess CO2 kind of shoved into the oceans right now. And one interesting study that came out of UCSD recently was they took these little nanomotors, little nanobots, and they can absorb CO2 from the water and then turn that into calcium carbonate, and they just sort of eject that calcium carbonate. These are powered on hydrogen, and I think they're made out of titanium, so this is nowhere near ready for any sort of large scale or practical purposes, but it's a very interesting sort of study. So that calcium carbonate is a much more stable form of stuff. All right, so we've talked about everything up until now has been carbon negative emissions, actually pulling it out and storing it somewhere and somehow. Now what we're going to talk about are a couple of different ways that will help bridge the gap. So carbon neutral fuels. This is the idea where you take CO2 and ideally it's captured from the atmosphere. So that's what the work at ASU is for, so that they can capture it out of the air and then use it as feedstock. And so I included the stoichiometry formula there, where you take carbon dioxide and hydrogen and you can get out of it water and methanol. And methanol is a really useful fuel that can be converted into different things. You can mix it into existing fuels that we currently use, and it's a stable form of energy. Just this week, there's been a lot of media coverage of some work that came out of Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Have Has anybody seen this?
Where they're producing ethanol.
It was ethanol, yeah. And so I have another video.
Here at the Center for Interface Material Sciences, we're using nanotechnology to study how we control chemical reactions on catalysts. We were actually studying how to take carbon dioxide and convert it to what we thought was going to be methanol. It turned out to be ethanol, which was very scientifically interesting, and it was unexpected because we didn't think the catalysts we're working with would do the entire reaction on its own. We originally started trying to grow a type of catalyst based on a material called graphene. And as it turned out, with the equipment we have, we couldn't make graphene, but we could make these little tiny spikes. And so these little spikes are actually like tiny lightning rods. And so they actually taper down to a tip that's just a few atoms thick. And what that does is it concentrates the electric field right there at the tip and creates a very high electric field that you wouldn't get on a normal flat catalyst. And one of the nice things about this catalyst is it actually has a yield of around 63-65%. We've measured as high as 70% depending on the sample, which means that of all the carbon dioxide and all the electricity that's going into it, you don't waste much of it. The majority of it ends up actually converted to ethanol. And it matters technologically because ethanol is a fuel. You can use it in the current vehicle fleet right now with no modifications. The CO2 or the carbon dioxide is a problem right now, and if you can use it, then you're preventing it from going to the atmosphere. And because this reaction operates at room temperature, it can be turned on and off very easily with no real energy penalty. And so we see this as a way that you could store extra electricity from the grid. Typically, the grid is destabilized by variable sources like solar and wind. And so there's a limit to how much variable electricity or variable source electricity we can put into the grid. If we could have a variable load that we turn on and off at will, then it gives us a way of actually sucking that electricity up and using it.
So the reason that that's interesting is that last part that he's talking about. Again, this is carbon neutral, and we're talking about instead of pulling oil out of the ground and burning that for fuel sources, and then seeing that stuff that was out of the ground added into the air, we're now taking it out of the air and then burning it, and then it goes back into the air. So this is why that conference that I went to is called Closing the Carbon Cycle, because it's now a closed loop, and then that makes it easier to help us transition over to that point. Because if we go back to that very first graph that I showed at the beginning about how rapidly we need to start pulling down our emissions, this is one way to help do that. And the baseload power is also very interesting because one of the main problems that we're dealing with when it comes to wind and solar is that some things just don't work at night or when the wind dies down or that sort of thing. So we need to have sources in order to meet that sort of baseload need. Any questions about the fuels?
It's great, by the way, I have to head up early.
Okay, thanks for coming. All right, this last one is called carbon markets. And so this is the result of cap and trade schemes, which you guys have probably heard of. So what cap and trade means, you have a government entity that says businesses and people, organizations in our jurisdiction are capped at how much carbon dioxide they're allowed to emit over a year or a period of time. And if they need to emit more than that cap, then they're allowed to purchase what are called offsets. And offsets are as simple as just planting a forest or doing some land use restoration, like that soil restoration we were looking at. It also counts, and I disagree strongly with this, and this is why I'm not a fan of cap and trade as a solution to this stuff. It also allows, instead of building a coal-powered plant, you could build a natural gas plant, and you could call that an offset, even though you are still technically emitting stuff. This is from a report that looked at the last couple of years. So in worldwide markets, they were able to sell 84 million tons of carbon dioxide. Average price about $3.3 per ton. We know a lot about this because one of our members who isn't here has a business where he connects project developers who make these things with people who are buying these offsets. You as an individual are probably only exposed to offsets if you like buy an airplane ticket. You might sometimes see like the ability to, for an extra like $15, offset the environmental impact of your trip right now. It's a small amount, and it requires, in order for it to really succeed, it would require like everyone sort of participating in this. There's a voluntary market as well, and companies like Microsoft have recently gone completely carbon neutral by buying offsets. But it's not as widely used. Here's an example, a graph from the same report showing the sorts of different types of projects that people do. So wind is the most popular and has accounted for the most amount of offsets. That red plus is reforestation, and that's a UN-driven program. Landfill methane capture, tree planting, clean cook stoves. So that would be in more developing parts of the world where they're, instead of burning biomass or coal, they're a little bit cleaner fuel sources like natural gas, and so on. And the various price things. One of the problems with this is that it's sort of expensive to build these projects, but there's not enough demand. Like the supply is there, but there's not quite enough demand, so the price is low, and that makes it harder for people to supply more.
Is this related to the carbon tax?
No, but I have a slide about that, so we'll talk about it. So who's doing this? On the nonprofit side, there are the two at the top, the Center for Carbon Removal and the ASU Center for Negative Carbon Emissions, are sort of leading the way in terms of institutes that are doing the research. The Center for Carbon Removal is at UC Berkeley, and they are more focused on education and outreach and looking at the philanthropic approach to funding the research into this sort of thing. It was started by a former environmental consultant, and so they're sort of taking that approach. It's a much more like policy-driven sort of approach. And then the ASU Center, that was the videos that we saw inside the labs. That's much more of a research-driven approach, and they're looking at various things with fuels and algae and the capture and all that kind of stuff. Then there's us, the Carbon Removal Seattle group, and then the Technical University of Denmark. They're closely tied with ASU. Because a lot of the people there have worked together previously at different universities, and so they're also doing a lot of fuel cell research. So where ASU is doing a lot of the research into the capture of the CO2, the DTU is doing more of the fuel cell research for the actual conversion process. On the right side, the for-profit, so this is just a sampling of some of the companies, but there really aren't that many. Carbon Engineering, Infinitree, Climeworks, Global Thermostat, Skytree are all pretty much doing the same thing in terms of direct air capture, like that thing we saw earlier of the big fans, and they're capturing it and storing it. New Light Technologies is a little bit different, and they're pretty interesting. So they've been around for about 12, 15 years, something like that, and they take, actually they use, I think, mostly methane at this point. They're trying to get to the point where they're using CO2. So they take this feedstock methane, and they've developed a catalyst that they can create a reaction where they're able to create plastic out of this. And it's a plastic that competes on both cost and quality with petroleum-based plastics. And they've been at this for a very long time. They've recently started to be successful. IKEA recently signed on to IKEA's goal, I think, is to source 50% of all of their plastics from a renewable source like New Light. New Light has also made deals with Dell Computer to the casings for their computers will be made out of this plastic. And this is really cool because this is now sequestering. It's a plastic, it's not going to break down over time. It's trash, which is not necessarily a great thing, but we're able to get these greenhouse gases into a very stable form. And that's really the name of the game, is getting this stuff into a stable form so we don't have to think about it anymore. So right now, if you are a Washington voter, what you can do is vote yes on the carbon tax that's going to be on the ballot. The ballots were mailed out. I think we'll start getting them like today, I think. So what this initiative does is it institutes a $25 per ton carbon tax on the manufacturing industry in Washington. And that is going to rise over time. It goes up like it goes up like a little bit, and then it's fixed to inflation and increasing 3.5% every year.
Over a very long time period. So one of the things that's praised about it is that because of that long time period and the high price that it ended at, there's a lot of margin certainty, much more so than compared to other taxes, other mechanisms like that.
Mm-hmm. This is modeled after a similar tax in British Columbia, but British Columbia's tax price is fixed at, I think, $30 a ton or around there. And I think that's Canadian, so that's more like 20, 22, something like that. They're waiting, in Canada, they're waiting for the Canadian federal government to institute a carbon tax, which Trudeau recently said that they plan to do within the next couple of years. Which is cool. What this one does is to help offset the fact that they are increasing a tax. The goal for this initiative is to make it revenue neutral. So they are going to reduce the state sales tax by 1%. And then they're also going to help fix the fact that Washington has the most regressive tax structure in the country by funding the working families tax rebate up to $1,500 a year for low-income households. So it's just like handing tax revenue to lower income households. And for those manufacturers to help offset the fact that they're going to be paying a lot more all of a sudden, it's getting rid of the B&O tax. And because we don't have an income tax here in Washington, a lot of our revenue source comes from the business and occupational tax, which is a tax on gross revenues on all businesses in the state. So the idea is that this is really just a tax swap. We shouldn't really see any sort of difference in terms of how it affects us as individual citizens and consumers, but it's aligning incentives properly so that we start incentivizing people to reduce their emissions. I think this is a perfectly designed plan, as best as we've seen so far. It's really interesting because it's been a very grassroots-driven plan, and there was a really good article in Vox a couple days ago, or a day or two ago, that was that sort of detailed the long and interesting political situation behind it, because it turns out that all of the environmental groups in Washington severely oppose this bill. I won't go into that, but you should look for those. I shared that article on Facebook yesterday, I think. So check that out because it's
Actually, you have 2 words on why they're opposing.
They want to they want to include a whole lot more stuff in it, because what they want is a carbon tax that raises revenue, so that they can then use that revenue to invest in like clean energy things and to invest in more affordable housing.
Oh, it's not that they oppose the bill; they want more.
Well, yes, but they do oppose the bill.
Oh.
In fact, many, like the Sierra Club and 350.org and any other big name ones, but they've come out. Well, the Sierra, did they go to neutral?
They vote with group support. I think that there are some other smaller groups, there's one called Front and Center, that are actively opposed.
Yeah, so it's a very weird situation. So you should, and the that Vox article I shared details it really well. It's interesting more from just a political perspective. Okay, so I started to say at the very beginning of this presentation why I started this group, and now you have more context. My goal is to start a business, develop a business model that accomplishes this goal of carbon removal in a profitable way. And I have found the direct air capture stuff the most interesting, but there are other ways to do it. But a lot of the stuff that we looked at throughout this were really large-scale industrial commercial things that, unless you are coming from the energy industry, you're probably not going to be really impacting the fuels market. Or unless you are somehow some very connected player in agriculture, you're not going to be affecting soil restoration. So I'm more interested in trying to take a consumer-driven approach where we can create products that are carbon negative and remove carbon dioxide and sell those to people where maybe they won't be removing all that much, but in volume it might add up to a significant amount. So the sort of plan is to develop a business model based on the existing research that's being done. Well, actually, step 0 before this is complete the team to do this, especially on the chemistry side. And then seek out grant funding, start trying to build stuff, try to get some private investment, and then go from there. But the mission of the company is going to be carbon removal and fixing climate change, not just like whatever the products are. So that was the reason I started the group, as a way to say, I'm here and I want to work on this. Does anyone else want to? I don't know anyone who was thinking about this at the time. Just so you know, we meet here in this office. It's typically the third Thursday, although it hasn't always been that case. But it's Thursdays, 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. We're here in Fremont. That's the URL, especially if you're watching the video. And I think, yeah, that's it.
I have, coming back to sort of the big question.
Yeah.
And that is like, what's your worst case scenario? So let's say we do A450. Let's say the ash caps do melt. Let's say the methane gets released. After that, are we hitting other like surplus life cycles, or are we like done at that point?
No, we're not done. No, things keep getting worse.
Okay.
Yeah, because the worst part about this is going to be the social unrest that happens. Because, so think about, as we are starting to see changing weather patterns, when, so the carbon removal, let me step back a little bit. Carbon removal is just one of several different geoengineering methods, and I didn't use that word at all because that has a lot of negative connotations for people. But there are other methods, like you could dump sulfates into the stratosphere, which would be more reflective of energy coming from the sun. So we're actually going to say, we're going to like create a little bubble. We don't know what the consequences of that are, and we can't test it without doing it. We could dump iron into the southern oceans, and that a sort of complicated process, but it involves phytoplankton like catching the iron and then like causing a plankton bloom, which they would store carbon in their organic matter, then they would die and then sink to the bottom of the ocean. So we're like trying to dump more carbon into the bottom of the ocean. Problems with that is, again, we can't really test it all that well, and eventually currents are going to bring that right back up, so it's not going to be truly sequestered. You could build a fleet of ships that sail around and just spray seawater up into the air above them, trying to create marine layer clouds and increasing the albedo of the reflectiveness of the oceans, which again reflect more energy. The problem is that would take so much energy and raw materials to do that it would totally defeat the purpose based on our current energy sources. So carbon removal is kind of the safest
So what were you
mechanism
mentioned
of
one
that.
time about in buildings sometimes the CO2 gets up to 1,000 parts per
Oh,
million.
yeah.
Then it affects us thinking. We don't think very clearly.
Yeah, that's true. There have been studies that look at so outside, this like 407 parts per million that we're at right now, that's measured outside, and that's sort of averaged across the globe. When we are indoors and we're in enclosed areas and we don't necessarily have great air filtration, we're constantly expelling carbon dioxide as we're breathing. And so you can see significantly higher concentrations of CO2 inside, which is interesting on the one hand because that presents an opportunity, because the more concentrated the air is with CO2, the easier it is chemically to extract it from the air. That's why most of the carbon capture stuff is happening at power plants, because it's so concentrated. But on the other hand, what Steve's mentioning is that there have been studies showing that our cognition abilities go down, and they start to go down a lot earlier than you would expect from this. So there's opportunity for trying to get hospitals, for example, to have better filtration like this, or office complex. Oh, hospitals are probably doing this neighborhoods, but office complexes, for example, anything where there's a large concentrations of people, it affects the way that you think and do stuff. Anyway, I was bringing up the aerosolizing the stratosphere because as we see changing weather patterns and countries that rely economically on, this is my fear, that rely economically on agriculture are going to see problems. If the people can't eat, then there will be violence and there will be ramifications from that, and they'll be demanding that their governments do something to fix this. Well, aerosolizing the atmosphere is cheap and easy, and you'll start to see results within months. So my fear is that it would be a poorer country somewhere in the world that, without international consensus, decides to start going rogue and doing this sort of thing to fix problems for their people, and we don't know what the effects of that might be. Yeah.
That leads into a related question from someone watching online. So how much economic damage with the current trajectory do we expect, and how would it be distributed?
I don't know of a number, and that's really hard to extrapolate. I have seen some very interesting studies looking at, there was a study done in the Philippines and looking at the long-term effects. So if we assume that, like I mentioned earlier, that we're not going to necessarily see more storms, but we are going to see more superstorms, and the amplitude of them increases. Well, the economic effects of those are pretty significant. And this study had looked at a very large typhoon that hit the Philippines in the 80s or so, and they did some like crazy data analysis to find that the ripple economic effects lasted 15, 20, 25 years after this storm, after they'd rebuilt everything, because it impacted how like children's education at the time was impacted. So that impacted the workforce that was after they had matured and grown up later on. So I don't know. There's probably been research on this, but I don't know off the top of my head that sort of stuff. But we're starting to see this already. You could make an argument that the events in Syria, the civil war in Syria, and the refugees that are coming out of there are climate refugees.
I guess I was trying to get just even or maybe ballpark of like what percentage of the world economy do you expect to just disappear without me? Like, are we talking 1%?
IPCC did some estimates on this, didn't they?
Yes, I don't know numbers, but there is this expectation that once you get up around 450 parts per million and you start getting self-reinforcing cycles and things start to heat up, the ocean becomes so acidic that the bottom of the food chain starts to drop out because of the little things that make shells that are eaten by fish can't make shells anymore. And you start having agricultural problems where, equatorial areas have droughts and can't grow crops. And then you have sea level rise, and you have a lot of people living not very far away from water, and so they move inland. And so for places that are highly populated like South Asia, that's a lot of unrest, and nation states become very challenged. And you have water issues with glaciers not supplying water any longer. So you start to have some really serious ramifications. And at a certain point, you're not going to be able to keep the population on the planet.
And we're also, we're still going to see population rise over the next long period of time. And hopefully it stabilizes around 11 billion people or so, which are what the estimates are showing. But we're going to have to figure out how to feed all of these people too, in the midst of all these problems, and provide energy for them. So
a lot of the people we know care a lot about what the most effective interventions are. So what organizations are doing the most to reduce carbon emissions per dollar, or doing the most to improve climate policy per dollar? Or maybe are there organizations that are trying to figure that out?
I think that's a very subjective question, because I'm personally of the opinion that this really isn't a policy. This won't be solved by policy. other than by taxation. But the political will to do this is not that strong. We did see that there was enough of a consensus to adopt the Paris climate protocols that very recently, once the EU signed on board, and so that happened very rapidly. But if you look at the language in the what they agreed to, none of it's binding.
Nor is it target
Right.
We agree with that.
Right.
Or even if we just go with carbon removal, what are the most effective carbon removal methods right now?
Well, it would be these organizations that I showed you here to sort of get back to your question. It's these folks, because that's it. There are other companies doing some similar things, and I might have missed a few in here. But if this is small, there are not that many people working on this worldwide. This is a relatively new-ish subject. A little bit of the history behind it is that this was always sort of understood as something that would have to happen, but a lot of the climate scientists' consensus was that if we invest too heavily into research into this, we are giving sort of a free pass to everyone else to continue emitting when the goal should be, let's start ramping down our emissions over time. So it wasn't until around 2008 or so that people started talking seriously about, okay, let's get to work on this because we're going to have to do this somehow. So as far as considering the most effective way to do this sort of stuff, it's probably through the Center for Carbon Removal has a report that they published earlier this year looking at philanthropic contributions to research into this, and it was pitiful. It was something like $50 million over the last 10 years total. That's why I think that this has to be something driven by a for-profit enterprise, because no one else has the incentives and ability to scale at the scale that we need in the time frame that we need to. And one of the big problems right now is financing. So let's imagine you're a socially conscious investor. So you're whether you're an angel investor or you are managing a VC fund or something like that, and you want to be helping out in environmental issues, you're going to go for the stuff that has a much more clear ROI than this. Most people would. So that's investing in renewables, solar and wind, investing in water filtration and desalination research, and all these other sorts of things that everyone already has kind of a good understanding of. So there was a clean tech bubble that sort of burst around 2011 when there had been a ton of research going into and a ton of financing going into various different clean tech companies, and then a lot of government money going into them too. So you've probably heard of Solyndra. That's kind of the poster child for just completely failed government investments. These companies that just were not successful and they could not be propped up with this investment. So that's really scared away a lot of private finance. So right now, the big problem for this is that there's just not enough research money going into it.
There's no value. The value of carbon, like if you get a carbon tax, you start getting a value of how much carbon is costing you and how much not.
That's true.
The price is so wide range, we don't know what it would be. And then once we do get a price, maybe the government could start funding part of it. Stuff that we don't have a wide range and there's no numbers.
We're not treating carbon dioxide as a waste product right now. And if you're, this is something Klaus Lackner talked about a lot at the conference. If you were just to dump your trash on the street in front of your neighbor's house, they would rightfully get upset about that and would call the authorities and you would get fined and all that stuff. But that's what we're doing right now with carbon dioxide. And I've heard someone describe it as we're in peak carbon right now. Because, and if you could, you should try to short carbon dioxide because there will be a price on it. It's just not there right now. Another thing that I heard at the conference was, and I thought this was interesting because as I've learned more about effective altruism community and the focus on existential risks, and I, especially after the EA Global Conference, I wondered why there was like no one talking about climate change at all and why there was focus in other areas. And the best answers I got were that it's because it's not an existential risk, meaning like total extinction, right?
So, yes, but the first answer that comes before that is usually they consider climate change to not be as neglected as other areas.
Okay.
So, for example, when you say like, oh, these are $50 million organizations, a lot of EA, like 3 years ago, was looking at $6 million all of EA.
Okay.
And so
it's even smaller.
It's even smaller, yeah. And so even though the conference was big and very exciting, and it's bigger now, a lot of EA is looking at what is like really the biggest thing to do per dollar, and you can like save a life for $2,000 with AMI.
Right.
And that's a very like well-known, understood like A/B test intervention. And so, and then the second question is, that's right. The perception is it's not an existential risk; it's more of a catastrophic risk, which is like the fact that we're talking about this in those terms is not a good sign for us as a whole. But yes.
Yeah. Well, something that was brought up was, and I did not fully follow this as it was explained to me, but if the dew point globally rises to the point, I might not be explaining this. One possible effect of climate change could be that we could get to the point where it's so humid that we can no longer sweat, which means we all die. And all mammals would die. So I would like to counter, at least on the existential part, I totally get the research part, that yes, this could kill us all. And that could be an outcome that we see. So it definitely warrants some attention for that reason.
This was a good time to like plug in Seattle Effective Altruism is an organization which
Actually, stay where you are because the camera is on you.
Who advertised this meetup, and we generally have meetups once a month. We haven't scheduled one forever yet, but it's usually a mix of like talk and discussion. So if you're interested, find us on either meetup.com or on Facebook or talking up. And so the general areas of concern right now tend to be more global poverty, global health, and existential risks of other varieties. But of course, like we all want to survive, so it's important to look into like different areas.
Yeah. Well, as every year goes by, there are more and more possible existential risks.
Yeah.
So. Any other questions? Did anyone see any more from online?
Thank you, Anthony. You support the time. Right.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, guys. Thanks for coming. All right, I'm gonna end the broadcast, I think.